Welcome to the new episode. Today we're going to be talking about the fun and exciting topic of box art. That's right, the artwork on the box that the Commodore 64 came in. Now, what's fun and exciting about that? Nothing really. I was just hoping it would make you want to watch. But let's talk about it. What we're looking at here, two Commodore 64 boxes. This one is an extremely early production release. It was the 450th Commodore 64 ever sold. This one is just a run-of-the-mill one that came a little bit later. The boxes are almost identical except for one big thing you'll notice in the artwork here. There are two different disk drives. The very early box shows a PET disk drive. The model isn't visible on it, 2040, 4040, 8050, we don't know, but it's one of those. The later one has a 1540 disk drive. I want to mention that technically the 1540 did not work with the Commodore 64. The 1540 was made for the VIC-20. For it to work with the C64, you needed to update a ROM chip. So the question in this video is, would this have worked? So that's what I'll talk about, and you're probably asking yourself, why in the world would you care? Well, there's a reason I'm doing this. If you look here on the box, CPM option. Commodore advertised that there was a CPM option for the Commodore 64. This box is from July or August of 1982, and the CPM cartridge didn't come out until almost a year later in 1983. So egregious was this false advertising that the U.S. Federal Trade Commission ordered Commodore to stop advertising the CPM option until the cartridge was available in sufficient quantities. So they had that bit of false advertising on the box. The 1540 is sort of false advertising. How about this? That's what we'll cover in this episode. All right, here we go. Commodore 64 on the left, early PET drive on the right. It happens to be a model 4040. And what I did to make it easy to explain this is I have their cables already plugged into them. The PET expects an IEEE 488 GPIB connector. The C64 expects this DIN connector. And as you can see, never the twain shall meet. So there's nothing for me to plug this into on the 4040, and there's certainly nowhere I can plug this in on the C64. So is this video over? Not so fast. Let me put that down. There was a market for the ability to connect IEEE 488 drives to the Commodore 64. This happens to be a bus card. It was made by a company called Batteries Included out of Toronto. Commodore did one of these also, but you can see right here it says IEEE 488. You connect your IEEE 488 cable there, and if I hadn't dropped it, that's the IEEE 488 connector from the back of the 4040. Connects there. This plugs into the cartridge port of the C64, and voila! You can use an IEEE 488 disk drive with a Commodore 64. This needs a tiny little wee bit of installation. Let's do that, and then let's talk about what the user experience was. Did it work? If so, what worked and what didn't? The installation instructions tell you to locate a cylindrical object marked R44, which happens to be a resistor, and clip a connector to that. This is not the clip that came with the bus card, by the way. I'm just using what I have laying around. There are 3 pins here on the bus card too, but if you look at the bottom of the PCB, they're all connected. So you can connect the wire to any of the 3 pins, whichever one you like. The first disk drive we'll look at is this Commodore 2040 dual 5¼ disk drive. This was the first disk drive Commodore ever released. It hit the market around April of 1979, and it has a fan in it that sounds like a Rolls-Royce jet engine when it spins up. My first test is going to illustrate how this works to store and retrieve your personal data. So let's pretend we don't have any commercial software on disk. We're just going to write our own programs out to this blank disk. I'm sending a new Commodore DOS command to the disk drive, abbreviated N. The bus card cartridge hijacks the kernel disk routines, and the 2040 disk drive shows up as device 8 with 2 logical drives, 0 and 1. Putting a 0 after the N here tells the drive to format disk 0. Now I'll type a simple basic program, save it to disk, and show you that I can load it back. So there you have it. I can use a Commodore 2040 IEEE 488 disk drive from 1979 with a Commodore 64 to save and load programs. Eventually, you'd want to move beyond just loading and saving your own programs, so you go to the store and you buy a C64 game that's intended to work with a 1541 disk drive. This game, On Track Racing by GameStar, happens to have no compy protection. Will this one work? Sorry for the awful sound quality, but that fan is something to compete with. As you can see, I was able to load and run a commercial software title. The disk format used by the 2040 and 1541 allow for read compatibility. By now, I'm feeling pretty good about my setup, so I go out and buy Epic's Winter Games on disk. Winter Games uses Vorpal copy protection. Will this work with a 2040 disk drive? In my imaginary scenario in this video, I already had a PET and a 2040 disk drive, so when I bought my fancy new C64 to upgrade from the PET, I thought I'd save some money and buy a bus card too instead of a 1541 disk drive. Then I could use my 2040 with my old PET and my new C64. It was at this very moment when I tried to load Winter Games that I realized my folly. I said earlier the disk format used by the 2040 and 1541 allow for read compatibility. Winter Games is a 1541 format disk, so why can't I load it from a Commodore 2040 disk drive? Well, before I get into why Winter Games doesn't work, let's talk about why the non-copy protected game for a 1541 does work in a 2040. And while I'm at it, I'll also explain what I mean by read compatible instead of fully compatible. When you format a 1541 disk, the drive ROM writes an empty file system structure out to the disk. It's laid out in 35 tracks written in concentric circles around the disk. Track 1 is the outermost track, track 35 is the innermost track. Track 18 is special. That's where Commodore's DOS stores the directory information and housekeeping information like the block availability map, which tracks available free space on the disk. Each track is divided into multiple sectors, but not every track has the same number of sectors. Track 1 near the outer edge of the disk can fit more sectors due to having more physical surface area around the circumference of the disk. So track 1 has 21 sectors, while track 35 only has 17 sectors. Each sector is made up of a header block and a data block. The header block contains 8 bytes of sector metadata. The data block contains the actual stored data. Looking at the header block, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but note that it's 8 bytes of data with a sync mark bit pattern before and a header gap bit pattern after. Similarly, with the data block, it's 260 bytes of data with a sync mark bit pattern before and an intersector gap after. As the disk is spinning past the drive's read head, it uses the bit pattern of the sync marks to detect the start of each header block or data block. Everything I just described applies to disks formatted by any of the drives listed here. 2040, 3040, 4040, 2031, 2031 LP, 1540, 1541. Every one of these drives uses the same overall disk format, so a disk formatted in any one of these disk drives can be read by any of the other disk drives. Now, why aren't they write compatible? Well, I said they all use the same overall disk format, and they do. Same number of tracks, sectors, track 18 is special, header block format's identical, data block format's identical, except for the header gap. The header gap on disks formatted by the 1540 and 1541 are slightly different than the header gap of every other drive listed. The difference doesn't affect reading data between the various drives, but it does mean there are write incompatibilities between the 1540, 1541, and every other drive listed. We know why the non-copy protected on-track racing 1541 disk was able to load from a 2040 disk drive. We know why all the drives I mentioned are read compatible but not write compatible. Now let's talk about why Winter Games won't load from a 2040 disk drive. After all, it's a 1541 formatted disk and loading a program is just reading data from disk, not writing, so this should work. I won't do a deep dive into exactly why Winter Games doesn't load, but generally speaking, many of the big software publishers back in the day used various forms of copy protection and custom fast loaders that relied specifically on the design of the 1541. The Bus Card 2 has internal ROM routines, and as part of its initialization during the boot process, it replaces the native Commodore 64 kernel disk I/O routines with its own. So when you type a load command, you don't need to do anything special for your program to load over the IEEE 488 bus instead of the built-in serial bus. So how does custom fast load code affect this? Well, many fast loaders worked by replacing Commodore's native serial bus wire protocol with something faster. I did an entire video that shows exactly how Epic's fastload works, so go check that out if you want to learn more. What it means to replace Commodore's native serial bus wire protocol with something faster is that the custom fastload code ignores the kernel disk I/O routines and directly manipulates the pins on the 6526 CIA chip to implement a faster wire protocol across the serial bus. So the fastload code will be attempting to send signals over a bus that isn't even connected. Another thing that may cause issues is that the internal architecture of the 1541 is vastly different than that of the 2040. The memory map is different, so any C64 code that uploads to the RAM on the disk drive will break. It's common for fast loaders to upload custom code using m-w DOS commands sent to the 1541, and then executing the custom code using m-e DOS commands sent to the 1541. The 1541 data buffers, which are mapped in the 1541's RAM from hex 0300 to 07FF, are typically used for this purpose, and the 2040 has nothing mapped from 0288 through 0FFF. The only RAM space they have in common is 0 page, so any C64 code that relies on uploading custom code to the 1541 is most likely going to break if it attempts to upload to the same RAM location on a 2040. Next up is the 4040. The 4040 is nearly the same drive as the 2040. It got updated 2.0 ROMs, which fixed some bugs and added new features like relative file support. As such, the behavior will be the same as we saw with the 2040. I'll speed this section up. Likewise, loading a non-copy protected game will also, quote, just work. And winter games will not work any better on a 4040 than it did on a 2040 for all the same reasons. Moving on to the 2031 disk drive, and we can expect the same behavior here. I won't bother doing an initial format on the disk so you can see that it is read compatible with the disk I created on the 4040. On-track racing will, quote, just work. The 2031, while still being an IEEE 488 drive that was created for the PET, is far more similar to the 1540 and 1541 than it is to the earlier PET drives. The design of the 1540 and 1541 are based on the 2031's design, with the main difference being a serial versus parallel bus. The 2031 even runs DOS 2.6, just like the 1540 and 1541. However, winter games still won't work. Most likely in this case simply because the code running on the C64 is trying to talk over the serial bus, which isn't connected. Next, I'll show you the Commodore 8050 disk drive. This one can still be used with the Commodore 64 using an IEEE 488 interface like the Bus Card 2 I'm using, but it has no 1541 compatibility whatsoever. The 2040, 4040, and 2031 I already showed you were all read compatible with the 1541 due to using the same 35-track file system format, resulting in a storage capacity of 664 256-byte blocks for a total of 170K. The 4040 is shown having double that capacity, but it's because there are two drives in the enclosure, not because the individual drive format is different. The 8050, however, boasts a whopping 1 megabyte capacity due to a 77-track format with more sectors per track. That worked, and wow, look at that. 2,051 blocks free on the 8050 compared to only 663 on the 1541 compatible discs. There's no point in showing you any other tests like on-track racing or winter games. The 1541 disc format is simply not recognized by the 8050. So I'll move on to an 8250 disc drive now. Like the 8050, the 8250 is also not compatible with the 1541 disc format, but it's also not compatible with the 8050 disc format. The 8250 is truly a beast with a 2 megabyte capacity supported by a 154 track file system format. These drives were supposed to be used with quad density discs, but I've not encountered any issues using double density discs. Again, I'll only do the disc format save and load tests with the 8250. Double wow. 4,132 blocks free on the 8250 compared to 663 on a 1541 formatted disc. The last IEEE 48 drive I'll test with the C64 in this episode is the SFD 1001. These use the same drive mechanism as the 8250 and they are fully compatible with the 8250. The difference is that it's a single drive in the 1541 style enclosure. That's it for this episode. What did we learn? Well, the box art wasn't completely false advertising. You absolutely can use a Commodore 64 with PET disk drives. Now, I don't know if it was a situation like the CPM cartridge where it didn't come out until a year later. I'm not sure when Commodore released their IEEE 48 cartridge, but it did actually work. Now, why would somebody have wanted to do this? Well, the one use case I can think of would be if you were running a bulletin board system back then. Having like the 8250 or the SFD 1001 with parallel transfer speeds and the increased capacity would have been awesome back then. Other than that, I mean, maybe there are a few edge cases. I can't think of any, and I think it would have been really difficult knowing that there was this vast library of commercial software that wouldn't work with your drive. So maybe you had one of these for the higher capacity and faster transfer, and then used the 1540 for playing games. I don't know. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you next time.